Hey guys, tonight we're stepping inside a cramped smoky turf house, perched on the edge of the North Atlantic sometime around the 13th century. The wind outside howls like a choir of ghosts, frost coats the wooden doorframe, and your only light comes from a flickering tallow lamp hanging from a beam overhead. You're cold, hungry and wrapped in layers of wool and animal skin. And dinner? Well, let's just say you're hoping there's still something edible left from last fall's supplies. This isn't a survival game. This is life in medieval Iceland during winter. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're tuning in from somewhere cozy and warm, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. I love seeing how far this sleepy little journey travels. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're sitting cross-legged on a fur-covered bench. Your breath clouds in the air. Outside, the snow piles so high it presses against the tiny windows like a white curtain. Inside, you're eyeing a wooden barrel in the corner. It holds the family's most guarded treasure, preserved food. You'll need every scrap of it if you want to make it to spring. Winter in Iceland can last 6 months. That's 6 months without fresh vegetables. 6 months with nothing growing outside except ice. You can't just pop out to the corner market, unless your local grocer happens to be a particularly friendly sheep. Most families lived on isolated farms, often separated by miles of snow-covered land. You didn't visit neighbours in winter unless it was a matter of life or death, or if someone's goat had wandered off again, which honestly counted as life or death depending on how hungry you were. The first rule of surviving an Icelandic winter: store food like a paranoid squirrel. Every summer and fall, families preserved as much as they could. Meat, fish, dairy, grains, then hoped it wouldn't run out. Spoiler, sometimes it did. Tonight, your host offers you a slice of something chewy, salty, a little tangy. It's probably smoked lamb or maybe dried fish. Either way, it's been hanging in the pantry since August, aging in the open air with no seasoning but salt and thyme. There's a rich tradition of leaving food to ferment or rot, depending on your perspective, and then declaring it a delicacy. You choose slowly, grateful. You're not picky this time of year. Historians still argue whether the average Icelandic farmer had enough to survive on through the entire winter. Some say the storage methods were reliable. Others believe famine was a frequent guest. The house is one long room shared by the whole family. There's no dining table, no private kitchen. Just a communal space where people sleep, eat, talk, and occasionally argue over who stole the last hunk of cheese. And yes, you're sleeping next to the pantry, not because it's convenient, but because your body heat might keep the dairy from freezing solid. Outside, the wind rattles the roof sod. The door creaks on its leather hinges. Somewhere in the darkness, a sheep bleats with the long-suffering tone of someone who also didn't sign up for this climate. Dinner ends with a drink of sour whey, a byproduct of cheese-making. It's cloudy, tangy, and served lukewarm. Think of it as Icelandic Gatorade, but without the sugar or the branding. There's no dessert, there usually wasn't. If you're lucky, there might be a small bit of honeycomb left over from the summer bees, or a dried berry or two, but most sweet things were rare and quickly eaten before the first frost even hit. Food was fuel. It had to last. So every bite was rationed with care, even if it tasted like wet wood and goat breath. You don't complain. You're just grateful there's something in your bowl tonight. You settle under your blanket, full for now. Your breath still mists in the air. You close your eyes, listening to the wind and the soft rustle of someone else chewing very slowly. Because yes, they are absolutely savouring that last bite of dried haddock. You wake up with your nose cold and your feet colder. The fire burned out sometime before dawn, and now the only warmth in the room is trapped under layers of wool and body heat. Your stomach grumbles, reminding you that survival isn't just about staying warm, it's about finding something edible. Again. You shuffle over to the back wall, where slabs of meat hang from wooden beams like strange leathery curtains. The air smells smoky and sour. You reach up and touch a piece. It's hard as stone, but it's food. Probably. Welcome to the subtle art of meat preservation. In medieval Iceland, fresh meat was a summer luxury. Once the frost crept in, everything had to be preserved. And without refrigerators, Icelanders got creative. They smoked it, salted it, dried it, or, if they were feeling especially brave, fermented it. You chip off a slice of hankjut, or hung meat. It's smoked lamb, and yes, it was literally hung up for weeks in a smoky shack until it absorbed enough flavour to taste like a campfire hugged a sheep. It's chewy, intense, and deeply comforting when the world outside your window is trying to freeze your eyelashes off. Historians agree that smoking was one of the more effective preservation methods. Iceland had no shortage of wood scraps, dung or turf to burn, though the flavour of your meat often depended on which one you used. Dung-smoked lamb? Not as bad as it sounds. Still, you probably won't find it at Whole Foods. Next to the smoked meat you spot something wrapped in cloth and buried in gravel. This is not for the faint of heart. It's haikal, fermented shark. Greenland shark, to be specific. Too toxic to eat fresh. Its flesh was buried underground to rot for weeks or months, then hung to dry. The result? A chewy, ammonia-scented bite that smells like cleaning products and tastes like regret. But you don't gag. You chew politely. Because this is not just food. It's survival, tradition, and possibly a dare. Today, hackal is mostly eaten on special occasions. But in the Middle Ages, it was just another way to get protein through the long dark. Historians still argue whether it was ever widely consumed or mostly used as a last resort, when your pantry had more cobwebs than calories. You glance at the hearth. There's a pot warming over the fire now, something bubbling inside. It's probably meat stew. Tough cuts boiled for hours to make them chewable. You lean over and inhale. Salty, fatty steam with maybe a hint of dried onion or seaweed if you're lucky. A good stew might include every leftover scrap. Bones, bits of tendon, maybe some blood. Nothing was wasted. Every part of the animal had value, and if it could hold flavour or fat, it went into the pot. You ladle out a portion and sit back down, bowl in hand. It's not glamorous, but it's warm. You sip, savour, and try not to think about how many weeks of winter remain. The stew sticks to your ribs, coating your insides with warmth like edible insulation. Above you, meat still hangs from the rafters, gently swinging in the draught. It's a reminder. Every bite you eat now is one less bite for next week. Rationing isn't just wise, it's law. There were actual medieval rules about how much meat a household could consume per person, especially during lean years. But some families had clever workarounds. There's evidence of underground pits used to preserve meat at stable, cold temperatures. Others built special storage sheds far from the main house, not just to keep out pests, but maybe to stop midnight snackers. As you finish your bowl, you lean back and close your eyes. For now, you're full. The stew simmers quietly behind you. Outside, the storm's picked up again. You can hear the wind slicing across the hills like a blade through cloth. You may not know what day it is, but you know what matters. Meat on the rack, soup in the pot, and one more morning survived. You're handed a wooden bowl filled with the stuff. It's cold, creamy, and just tart enough to make your cheeks twitch. But with a spoonful of barley, or maybe a dribble of honey from that long-guarded stash, it becomes downright comforting. And the best part, it lasts. Once fermented and stored in sealed barrels, skyr could survive the winter with you. Some families made enough during the summer to last them until the first thaw. Historians still argue whether it was a luxury or a staple, but archaeological finds suggest it was widespread and essential in households from chieftains to commoners. Besides skyr, you might find sour milk, aged until it practically became a drinkable vinegar. Or you might stumble upon misa, sour whey, left over from skyr making. It's watery, acidic, and probably not what you're dreaming about at night, but it worked wonders for hydration and preservation. There's even talk of surmjolk, or soured milk, thick enough to eat with a knife. That might not sound like a recommendation, but it was a sign that your dairy was aging beautifully. A little like cheese, a little like survival. And don't forget butter. If you were lucky enough to have a cow that produced well in summer, you churned until your arms gave out, then sealed the butter in wooden tubs. Stored cool and dry, it might stay good until winter's end. You smear a dab of it now on a hard crust of barley bread and feel briefly like royalty. Still, dairy didn't always come easy. Cows had to be fed through the winter too, and hay was limited. Most Icelandic farmers relied heavily on sheep or goats instead, which gave milk in smaller amounts, but required less fodder and were generally more durable in the harsh cold. Every drop counted. Sometimes you wonder whether people actually liked these fermented foods, or if they simply adapted. Modern tongues might recoil at sour, clumpy milk, but for them it was a taste of safety, of stored sunshine, of summer rebottled and preserved. Now and then, there are whispered stories of a forgotten barrel dug out from under the snow, its contents pungent enough to knock over a goat, but still technically edible. One account speaks of milk aged so long it had separated into unrecognisable layers. Someone still ate it, and you would too, because when the pantry runs low, edible becomes a broad and forgiving term. Outside you hear a creak and the thud of hooves. Someone's gone out to check the livestock. Even the cows, standing knee-deep in hay inside stone pens, look exhausted. They chew slowly, methodically, like they're also counting the days until spring. Back inside, you sip from a shallow cup of whey and wrap your cloak tighter. The dairy barrel is resealed, the spoon cleaned with snow. Tomorrow it will all taste a little more sour, a little more real. And yet, oddly, you don't mind. There's something soothing about these ancient routines, about curd and whey and the soft scrape of wooden spoons in wooden bowls. Your belly is full of old milk, your heart is full of quiet, and the snow continues to fall. You pull your cloak tighter as you step outside. The cold hits you like a wall, sharp, bracing, and unrelenting. The sky hangs low and grey above the frozen fjord, and the snow crunches beneath your boots like broken chalk. You're heading to the water's edge, because today, you're fishing. In medieval Iceland, fish weren't just a source of food, they were the lifeline. While animals were slaughtered and grains were scarce, the sea remained, cold, constant, and teeming with life. It was one of the few things that didn't vanish when the frost came. You wade into the shallows with a net in hand and cold in your bones. The North Atlantic doesn't care if you're tired or hungry. It just rolls on, icy and infinite. Most Icelanders fished year-round, though in winter it meant braving freezing winds, treacherous waves, and fingers so numb they couldn't untie a knot. Still, it was worth it. Cod, haddock, halibut. These weren't just dinner, they were currency. Salted and dried, a single fish could feed a family, or be traded, or stored for weeks on end. You cast your net hoping for cod. Cod was the king of Icelandic fish, rich in protein, easy to preserve, and oddly dignified even when dried into something resembling a weather-beaten shoelace. Back on shore, the catch is brought to the yalla, a wooden drying rack where fish is hung by its tail and left to air cure in the briny wind. The result? Hard fiska, hard fish. You've probably never gnawed on a food this aggressively chewy. It flakes apart eventually, especially if you smear it with butter. And yes, you will. Historians still argue whether fish dominated the Icelandic diet purely out of necessity, or whether it was, at times, genuinely preferred. Some sagas describe lavish fish feasts, while others mention it with the same enthusiasm you'd reserve for chewing bark. You pull in the net, a silver flash, success. A flopping cod smacks against your boots. It'll join the others on the rack soon, transforming slowly under the wind's patient hand. Sometimes, fish was cooked fresh, poached in seawater, stewed with bits of whatever else was available, or grilled over embers if fuel allowed. But most often, it was dried and stored. The taste? Somewhere between tough jerky and sea breeze. Back home, the fish is gutted, cleaned and salted, if you have salt. Salt was precious, often imported, and not always available. Some families used brine, or simply relied on the cold air to do the job. A clever few even buried fish in the sand to slow the spoilage. Then there's lisingur, not quite fish oil, not quite soup. More like a thick, translucent ooze rendered from fish liver. You dip your spoon into it cautiously. It's dense, slightly metallic, and rumoured to keep you strong, or at least breathing. And let's not forget the fishing boats, sturdy wooden rowboats manned by neighbours or relatives. You imagine rowing out into the grey sea, wrapped in damp wool, hoping the waves stay friendly. Every voyage was a gamble. The sea gave, and the sea took. Still, fishing was so essential that laws were written around it. Disputes over boat access, best coves, and communal drying areas were taken seriously. These weren't just jobs, they were lifelines. You walk back from the fjord with your catch tied in a rope over your shoulder. Your boots are soaked, your face raw, but you're smiling. This fish means your family eats tomorrow. Maybe even the next day too. Inside, the house smells like stew and smoke again. Someone grates a sliver of dried fish into a pot. Someone else folds the net, checking it for tears. No one speaks much. They're tired and busy. You place your fish on the rack side by side with others. tails up, heads down. It joins the slow parade of drying life, dangling in the wind like paper lanterns for very practical gods. Later, you'll sit by the hearth, chewing a strip of hardfisker, watching the flames. It's a taste you never quite get used to, but it's familiar, anchoring, real. And that is enough. You wake up to the smell of smoke and the sound of chewing. Someone's gnawing something dry and dense near the hearth. You squint through the dim light and spot what looks like a square of bread, though calling it bread might be generous. Today, you're exploring the hardest part of Icelandic cooking. Literally, bread, grains, and the quiet art of making food out of almost nothing. In a land where grain doesn't grow well, bread is an act of sheer stubbornness. Barley was the most commonly grown grain in medieval Iceland, but even that struggled under the short growing season, volcanic soil, and sudden frosts. When the barley failed, which it often did, families had to get creative. You sit by the hearth and bite into a barley flatbread. It's thin, a little burnt around the edges, and dense enough to make your jaw regret its life choices. But it's filling, and when it's warm, slathered with a bit of sour butter, it's even almost pleasant. Still, barley was a luxury. Most families could only spare a little, and when grain ran low, they mixed in other things: tree bark, moss, even dried fish powder. You blink? Yes, fish flour. It's not just for the truly desperate. It was actually used in some communities to stretch dough further. Historians still argue whether bark bread was common or just a famine food, but the evidence suggests it wasn't rare. Elm or birch bark was dried, ground, and added to the dough, giving it a fibrous, bitter flavour and a distinctive chew. You're offered a piece now. You try it, politely. It tastes like determination, and maybe a hint of regret, but it fills your belly and that's what counts. Sometimes households would make something called laufabröd, a crisp, decorative bread often reserved for winter feasts. Delicate and snowflake-shaped, it was fried to a golden crisp when oil or fat allowed. You're not having that today, though. That's for later, if there's any oil left by then. Instead, you help stir a pot of gråter, barley porridge, cooked low and slow over the fire. If you're lucky, there's a splash of milk in it, or a dab of butter, or a pinch of dried herbs. More often, it's just grain, water, and willpower. You eat it warm with a carved wooden spoon. It sticks to your ribs and your teeth. It's not glamorous, but it's better than bark. There's a small chest in the corner of the room, and inside it, your emergency stash. A sack of imported rye flour, carefully rationed for midwinter. A handful of dried peas, and even a few hazelnuts, traded from afar, maybe from Norway. These things weren't just food. They were symbols of connection to the outside world, and Iceland needed that. The island's isolation made every foreign ingredient precious. Grain, especially, had to be imported when local harvests failed, and failure was a frequent guest, escorted by frost and escorted out by hope. You watch someone knead a lump of dough, adding water sparingly. The wood oven glows faintly, fueled not by firewood, which is rare, but perhaps by dung or driftwood. That too influences flavour. You wonder if this loaf will taste like moss, or memories. By now your hands are dusted with flour. Maybe not flour in the modern sense, but some dry, powdery cousin of it. Your mouth is dry too. Bread like this isn't soft. It's an effort, a discipline. But there's comfort in the routine, the slow mixing, the gentle heat, the knowledge that you're turning nothing into something, even if that something is mostly bark. Outside, the wind rattles the turf roof again. Inside, the flatbread crackles as someone cuts it into strips. You chew yours slowly, letting your jaw do the hard work. And then, for just a moment, with a mouthful of barley bark bread and a spoonful of gritty porridge, you feel full. And that's more than most. You're halfway through your bark bread when the door creaks open. A gust of frozen air sweeps in, followed by 3 red-nosed neighbours and what might be a goose under someone's cloak. It seems tonight is special. Feasts were rare during the Icelandic winter. Food was too precious to waste on frivolity. But now and then, on holidays, saint days, or the occasional wedding, you pulled out the good stuff, or at least the slightly less preserved stuff. Tonight, you're witnessing the curious balance of feasting and fasting, regulated not only by tradition, but by law. You sit near the hearth again as someone unwraps the goose. It smells slightly smoky, a little funky, and incredibly exciting. There's murmuring about whether to roast it or boil it with dried herbs. Eventually the boil wins, less fuel required. A few people are nibbling something you haven't seen before, a thin brittle disc, lauferbraued. You get a piece, and it shatters gently in your mouth, crispy and warm. It's a once-in-a-season treat, more artwork than sustenance. Every family had their own pattern, passed down like edible family crests. The fire burns brighter tonight. A guest strums a small harp. Someone hums a song that's older than any name in this room. And then someone, probably the chattiest uncle, starts quoting food laws. Because yes, in medieval Iceland, even mealtimes had rules. The Gragars, Iceland's medieval law code, included numerous food regulations. How animals were butchered, who got which cut, even which foods were allowed on certain days. Especially during the Christianization of Iceland in the 11th century, fasting days multiplied, and rules grew stricter. Historians still argue whether most Icelanders truly observed these fasts or simply paid lip service. Evidence suggests some flexibility, especially in remote areas where survival often trumps scripture. But on feast days, you followed the traditions to the letter. It wasn't just dinner, it was a ritual. You take a bowl of stew, made richer tonight, with a slab of salted lamb added to the usual fish broth. There are root vegetables too, which means someone dug into the carefully guarded cellar. A rare splurge. There's even ale, or something like it. A homemade brew, faintly fizzy and smelling of old grain and ambition. You sip. It's rough, but warming. You can see why people made up excuses to call a day a feast day. There are stories too. Tonight, an elder is telling one about a bishop who once arrived at a winter feast with his own keg of imported wine. He allegedly refused to eat the local food, claiming it smelled like his horse's saddle. You laugh, softly. The bishop didn't last long on that trip. Then someone passes around small sweet root pieces, candied angelica, if you can believe it. Grown in secret gardens and preserved in honey, it's like biting into a floral miracle. Definitely not an everyday snack. You notice something else tonight. Silence. Not awkward silence, but a quiet that settles in once the food is served. Everyone eats slowly, reverently, like they're aware that the next meal might not be this generous. The youngest child tries to sneak an extra piece of lauferbraued and is caught. There's a gentle scolding, a half smile. You're reminded that in a world with so little excess, generosity isn't about abundance. It's about sharing what little you have. You lean back on a wool blanket, belly warm, fingers oily. The harp player strums something soft. The wind howls outside, but inside all is still. A feast in medieval Iceland wasn't just about food, it was about memory, about marking time, about saying, so yes, the winter is long, but we are longer. You close your eyes for a moment, the taste of salt and barley still clinging to your tongue. The goose is gone, the bread is crumbs, but the fire glows, and that is enough. The feast lingers in your memory like smoke in wool. But now the fire's gone quiet, and the house is back to its usual stillness. The neighbours have gone, the goosebones picked clean, and someone's already muttering about rationing. A single celebration costs days' worth of careful planning. You wrap yourself in a heavy cloak and move toward the corner where the drink barrels sit. Tonight, you'll sample the lesser-known lifeline of medieval Iceland. The drinks. No, not the party kind, though there were a few of those. You're more likely to sip something practical. Sour. Strange. Slightly lumpy. Welcome to the wide, weird world of medieval Icelandic beverages. The first thing you try is Mæsa, sour whey left over from skier production. Thin, tangy, a bit cloudy, and as ever present in Icelandic homes as the cold draft under the door. It was used to quench thirst, preserve meat, marinate fish, and occasionally surprise your taste buds in terrible ways. You sip. It tastes like the memory of milk mixed with a dare, but it's hydrating, and it keeps. You don't waste a drop. Then there's Ool, a lightly alcoholic drink that's somewhere between beer and fermented grain soup. Made from malted barley, if you had some, or a mash of whatever grain-like material could be coaxed out of the soil. It's cloudy, fizzy, and probably a little unpredictable. You take a careful sip. Slightly sweet, vaguely hoppy, and with a faint back note of desperation. Honestly, not bad, especially when warmed over a fire. Some families spice their brews with juniper berries, angelica root or bog myrtle. whatever added flavour without using up food. Historians still argue whether most of these early brews had significant alcohol content, or if they were more like medieval energy drinks with a mild buzz. Either way, people drank them, often, even kids. Next, someone pours you a cup of blander, a drink made by mixing water with whey, sometimes with a bit of milk. Not glamorous, but safer than raw river water, which could carry all kinds of unpleasant gifts. Clean drinking water wasn't always guaranteed. Springs froze, wells turned brackish, and snow. Well, snow was technically drinkable, but also a thief. It sapped precious body heat. So people turned to drinks they could store, preserved liquids that didn't freeze easily or spoil quickly. You hear stories tonight of travellers carrying skins filled with whey across the tundra, stopping only when the ice cracked beneath their boots or their fingers stiffened around the cork. One elder mutters about a now-lost drink made from fermented seaweed. Someone else claims to have tasted something called seal broth beer. You choose not to ask. And occasionally there was imported wine or mead, rare, expensive, and typically reserved for clergy, chieftains, or weddings. Most families never saw a grape, but when a barrel did appear, it was treated with reverence and quickly emptied. You're handed a clay cup, filled with what might be birch sap, a thin, slightly sweet liquid tapped from trees in the early spring. It's rare and light, and makes your tongue think of thaw and growth and warmth. Someone must have saved it in secret. Every sip of every drink tonight tells a story, not of indulgence but of ingenuity. A land without vineyards, without coffee or tea, without cocoa, and yet still, people found ways to pour comfort into a cup. You finish your Earl slowly, listening to the wind. Your body's warm now, not just from the fire, but from the quiet strength of fermented things. Things that waited, things that lasted. As you set the cup down and wrap yourself tighter in your cloak, someone across the room is already soaking dried herbs for tomorrow's brew. You don't know what it'll taste like, but you know you'll drink it, because in Iceland, a warm cup might just be the difference between one more night and one too many. The hearth is down to embers now. Orange glows flicker against the stone walls, casting the room in a sleepy amber haze. You sit close, wrapped in furs, belly warm with stew and fermented whey. But here's the truth. The food kept you alive. The drinks helped. But survival in medieval Iceland wasn't just about what you ate or drank. It was how you ate, and with whom. Because no one eats alone here. You glance around the room, your winter pod, your fire circle, your lifeline. You all sit close, not just for warmth, but for solidarity. A shared meal was more than just shared calories. It was rhythm, ceremony, maybe even therapy. Especially when there were only 5 hours of daylight and the wind sounded like ghosts with unfinished business. Every meal starts the same way. The bowl passed, the bread divided, the drink ladled. You don't get your own plate. You share. 2 or 3 people might dip into the same dish. Careful not to take too much, careful not to offend. There are rules. Quiet ones. Don't dig for the biggest piece. Don't scrape the bottom unless invited. Don't talk with your mouth full unless it's something truly urgent, like a house fire or a sudden realization about the butter shortage. Tonight's meal is simple. Dried fish softened in broth, a bit of barley porridge, and a sip of sour milk. But it feels comforting, familiar, even cosy, in that rough, flinty Icelandic way. The youngest child says something funny about the porridge being runny lava, and everyone chuckles. A rare, warm sound. You smile. These small jokes, the ones about fish faces, oversalted soup, and who snores loudest, these keep spirits from sinking when the sun barely rises. You reach for the communal spoon again, and notice an older man eyeing it too. You both freeze. Then he waves you on with a smirk. You nod in thanks. Peace restored. Historians still debate how strictly meals were structured. Some accounts suggest a rigid hierarchy, with chieftains eating first and servants last. Others claim more egalitarian patterns, especially in smaller households. Either way, the act of eating together was sacred. The fire, the food, the shared silence between bites. Occasionally someone tells a saga, those long winding stories full of vengeance and fate and sheep theft. They're often recited during meals, not just to entertain, but to remind everyone who they were, where they came from, who got eaten by a troll, that kind of thing. You listen, half smiling, as someone stumbles through a tale of 2 brothers, one lost at sea and the other cursed by a goat. You're not sure how much of it is true, but it passes the time, and the bread. Outside, snow taps against the turf walls. The cold waits, but it can't come in, not while you're here, passing a wooden bowl around the circle, licking your fingers, sighing softly between mouthfuls. Some nights, disputes arose. Food was stolen, rations were unequal, tempers flared. But those stories are whispered, tucked away like spoiled milk, acknowledged but not celebrated. Tonight there's harmony. Maybe it's the barley, maybe it's the Earl, maybe it's the understanding that none of you get through this winter alone. Someone tosses a scrap to the dog, curled up near the door, tail twitching. Even he knows he's part of the circle, maybe especially him. You lean back, eyes closing, a stomach not exactly full, but certainly not empty. A heart soothed by shared spoons and gentle voices. And tomorrow, the same, porridge, dried fish, butter if you're lucky, but also company, ritual, the quiet joy of enough. The embers pulse. A bowl is washed with snow. A laugh drifts through the room like steam. And you realise, not for the first time, that survival here isn't about power or strategy. It's about sitting in a circle and passing the bowl. The days are growing shorter still, or maybe they've stopped growing at all. You wake to darkness, you eat in darkness, you sleep while it's still dark. And when the sky does lighten, it's with the dull silver blue of a sun that can't quite commit. Supplies are thinning. You open the food chest and see what's left. 3 slabs of fish, a few brittle roots, and a jar of whey that's starting to look suspicious. The smell rising from it is assertive, but you'll drink it, because you have to. This is the part of winter no one romanticizes. You hear it in the way people chew, slower, more thoughtful. You see it in the careful scraping of the stew pot, in how the children no longer joke about lava porridge, in how someone counts the fish, again under their breath. The walls of the turf house close in. The smoke from the hearth clings to your skin, and even though you're surrounded by people, loneliness creeps in like the cold. Quiet, insistent, bone deep. Tonight's meal is a thin soup with too much water and not enough everything else. You dip hard bread into it, trying to convince yourself it's thicker than it is. You chew slowly, letting your jaw work over time to trick your stomach. Outside, the snow is melting just enough to reveal old footprints and the brittle tips of buried hay bales. Spring is thinking about returning, but it hasn't made up its mind yet. Historians still argue whether famine was an annual event or an occasional disaster, but saga literature and archaeological remains tell of years when people starved, when food stores failed, when salted fish was worth more than gold, and even the family dog was eyed differently. But not this year. Not yet. You're still holding on. A neighbour arrives with a trade. 2 smoked trout for a small round of sour butter. It's a fair deal, but it feels monumental. You share a quiet nod, no words exchanged. Everyone's voice is tired now, like it's been rubbed raw from too many words that never helped. Later, someone pulls out a sliver of dried angelica root. It's split among the children like candy. It's not sweet, but it's rare, and rare is magical. You fall asleep listening to the wind trying to pry the door open. Your dreams are full of thawed rivers and bright sun, of grass under your feet, of butter that spreads instead of chips. In your half-sleep you remember the spring thaw. You've seen it before. One morning the ice on the bucket cracks and doesn't freeze again. The sheep start bleating more urgently. The turf smells like soil again. Someone finds the first green sprig under the snow and brings it in like a trophy. It's not here yet, but you can feel it hiding just beneath the surface, waiting to push through. So you count the fish, you ration the bread, you water down the whey, and you wait. Because winter always ends. Because hunger is patient. But so are you. Because survival isn't about having more. It's about holding on. Wind down begins. 300 words. The fire is low now, just a dull, glowing hush beneath a blanket of ash. Everyone's quiet. Even the wind has stepped outside for a moment of rest. You lie down under a wool blanket that smells of smoke and thyme. The house creaks softly. Settling into the earth like it too is tired. Your belly isn't full, but it's not empty. And in this world, that's enough. The air is cool against your cheeks. The breath in your chest rises and falls like a tide that's seen many winters come and go. Somewhere in your memory a stew still simmers. A bowl is passed, a laugh is shared. A crust is broken, handed gently from one palm to another. The snow outside keeps falling, but slower now, softer, like it knows you're drifting and it doesn't want to wake you. So you let go of the cold, of the long dark, of the counting and the scraping and the measuring of days. You let it all fade like smoke curling up into the night sky. And as your thoughts soften, slow, and stretch into sleep, one simple truth remains. You made it through another night. You're warm, you're safe, and spring is on its way.
Hey guys! Tonight, we are tiptoeing into the strange, dimly lit corridors of Mughal justice, where the courtrooms weren't only filled with powdered wigs and cranky officials, but occasionally a goat wearing an expression of deep legal regret. Yes, you heard that right. Tonight's journey takes us to the peculiar, utterly baffling world of animal trials in the Mughal Empire, where peacocks strutted outside the courthouse, parrots might be summoned as witnesses, and even a crocodile could find itself on the wrong side of the law. You're probably thinking you wouldn't last long in such a courtroom, and, well, you're probably right. The Mughal emperors had a thing for ceremony, decorum, and elaborate justice systems that sometimes blurred the line between theater and actual law. And in the sleepy corners of the palace, those systems extended their velvet-gloved reach into the animal kingdom. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. It helps me keep making these weirdly specific, soothing historical rambles. And hey, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where and when you're listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge through the wide marble walkways of the Mughal palace. It's a balmy evening, the type where the air hums with the faint chirps of cicadas, and the courtiers drift about like ghostly shadows under the moonlight. The palace itself looms large and ornate, each archway promising yet another layer of extravagance or bureaucracy. You find yourself standing in front of the less glamorous, but still absurdly decorated, animal court gates. That's right. This isn't the grand hall where nobles debated taxes or land grants. This is the court, where animals were summoned for their alleged misdeeds. It smells faintly of jasmine, spiced meats, and perhaps a lingering trace of goat hair. You're not sure, but you suspect the goats are frequent visitors. A court official with a feathered turban gives you a sleepy nod, barely lifting his wax tablet. He's more interested in swatting flies than keeping the peace. Peacocks strut lazily across the courtyard, tail feathers dragging across the polished stone. A monkey perches on the balustrade, smirking at you like it knows you're the newcomer here. It probably does. Monkeys were regulars at these trials, after all. In the Mughal Empire, justice wasn't only about humans behaving badly. It was about keeping the animal kingdom in check, too. Or at least appearing to. The Mughal Empire, under rulers like Akbar and Jahangir, was a place of obsessive organization. They recorded everything: court proceedings, market prices, how many mangoes were sent to the emperor's kitchens that week, and yes, the occasional lawsuit involving a chicken accused of property damage. Historians still argue whether these animal trials were symbolic gestures to impress the crowd, elaborate rituals meant to teach moral lessons, or, more likely, a bit of both. The Mughals loved blending theater with administration, and sometimes the lines between the two got blurry. As you step inside the animal court, you see rows of tiny stools, scrolls stacked precariously on every table, and, of course, the defendants. a row of goats munching on weeds they aren't supposed to munch, a cat licking its paws nonchalantly, as if the entire proceeding is beneath it. And in the center, the judge, a human one, you assume, wearing a rather over-the-top robe embroidered with tiny elephants. You overhear a conversation between two scribes debating the legal distinction between incidental nibbling and premeditated crop theft. The debate is heated, yet sleepily paced, as though they've argued this exact point 100 times before. Your seat is hard and unforgiving, much like Mughal justice. You shift awkwardly as the first case begins. The accuser? A flustered court gardener. The defendant? A particularly plump goat, who, if you're honest, looks utterly unrepentant. The gardener waves a half-eaten cucumber in the air, lamenting the destruction of his carefully tended melons. The goat, for its part, chews the courtroom carpet. You wonder if that counts as additional evidence. The judge sighs. A bored scribe notes the offense: willful destruction of palace property. There is talk of imposing a fine on the goat's owner, though the goat is treated, at least formally, as the primary offender. This wasn't entirely unheard of in Mughal law. Animals could, in theory, be punished, but someone, usually the owner, paid the price. Sometimes, though, animals faced ceremonial punishments all their own. One odd tidbit floats to your ears from a nearby scribe: that goats deemed repeat offenders were sometimes made to wear embarrassing collars made of wood, painted in garish colors, marking them as public nuisances. Imagine that, a goat on a medieval Mughal version of a perp walk. The goat in the current trial seems blissfully unaware of this possibility. Still, the trial trudges on, every tiny procedural step observed. Witnesses are called, including the gardener's young apprentice, who nervously describes how the goat sneaked past the garden walls at night, possibly aided by, well, no one knows. But the apprentice suggests it might be a conspiracy of goats. You have to suppress a chuckle. Even in this most formal of settings, the proceedings have an air of quiet absurdity. The judge adjusts his elephant-embroidered robe and makes a note about increased fencing. The verdict? The goat's owner will be fined 3 silver rupees, and the goat will be paraded through the market square, wearing a bright red ribbon. It's both a punishment and, one suspects, a bit of cheap entertainment for the citizens. As the court scribe carefully logs the case into an absurdly long ledger titled "Offenses of the Animal Realm," you can't help but reflect on how, in a way, this is all part of the broader Mughal obsession with order, spectacle, and hierarchy. Even the most mundane creatures had a place within that carefully balanced web. And you? You're just an observer in the gallery, watching the sleepy wheels of Mughal justice turn, as peacocks fan themselves languidly and monkeys throw the occasional peanut. You barely have time to adjust your seat when the next case unfolds before your drowsy eyes, this time involving the palace's most notorious gang of rooftop troublemakers, the monkeys. Ah yes, the Mughal monkeys. If the goats were the courtroom regulars, the monkeys were the celebrities. Known for their elaborate rooftop heists, water jug tipping, and daring fig thefts, these primates had built a reputation so infamous that the court scribes actually maintained a separate ledger, titled Misdemeanors of Mischievous Monkeys. Tonight's case is a classic example of public disorder, Mughal style. Apparently, the monkey gang, known by the guards as the Langar Lot, had spent an entire afternoon throwing mango pits at the princess's embroidery circle. The court had been forced to intervene after the princess herself slipped on a particularly squishy mango, sparking an imperial tantrum that echoed through the palace for hours. The judge arrives fashionably late, more concerned, perhaps, with the positioning of his ceremonial turban than with the dripping mango mess still staining the courtroom tiles. The scribes shuffle their scrolls and squint at the monkeys, who now sit cross-legged on the defendant's mat, looking far too smug for creatures facing public disorder charges. A royal guard attempts to read the charges aloud, only to be interrupted by the loud, mocking squawks of a parrot perched on the judge's canopy. "Guilty! Guilty!" the parrot screeches, to the muffled amusement of the courtroom. Historians still argue whether the Mughal courts took these animal cases entirely seriously, or whether, in moments like this, even the judges had to stifle laughter. Some scholars suggest that animal trials served more as theatrical spectacles, courtly entertainments that reminded everyone, from the emperor to the lowest palace servant, of the emperor's dominion over all beings, feathered or furred. Regardless of intent, the trial continues with the sort of solemnity that makes the entire scene feel like a particularly surreal bedtime story. The prosecution presents the evidence: a broken embroidery hoop, 3 bruised mangoes, and an indignant scroll from the princess herself, complete with a hasty sketch of the guilty monkeys mid-flight from the scene. The defense? Well, the monkeys offer none. They sit in perfect, exaggerated innocence, tails curled neatly around their feet. A court official proposes consulting the parrot as a witness, given its supposed eyewitness account from the balcony, but another official groans at the idea. Parrots, after all, had a reputation for embellishment. Or, as one sleepy scribe notes in the margin of his scroll, parrots are prone to poetic exaggeration and cannot be trusted in matters of law. Still, the trial plods on. The court discusses the monkeys' prior offenses, which include an incident involving stolen ink pots and, perhaps more seriously, the sabotage of a royal astrologer's delicate sand drawing. Apparently, the astrologer had predicted an auspicious marriage date that was promptly erased by a monkey's muddy footprint. The judge, rubbing his temples in exaggerated exasperation, finally renders his verdict. The monkeys are to be confined to the Eastern Garden for 7 days, under strict watch by the court's animal wrangler. Of course, everyone in the courtroom knows the monkeys will escape by nightfall, but the sentence will be logged in the official record nonetheless. A courtier beside you chuckles softly, whispering that the monkeys might actually enjoy the Eastern Garden. It's lush, full of berry trees, and known for its shady lounging spots. You smile, the absurdity of the moment sinking into your bones like a warm cup of spiced milk. As the monkeys are gently ushered out, or, more accurately, as they dash away, cackling, the court prepares for its next case. But before you can fully drift into a daze, a commotion at the back of the hall draws your attention. 2 guards drag in an object draped in silk, a ceremonial cage, carried with all the pomp usually reserved for royal relics. Inside, a parrot, feathers ruffled, eyes darting suspiciously around the courtroom. The scribe announces the next case. Parrot accused of seditious speech. You nearly drop your scroll. Now that's a new one. And yet, not entirely unheard of in the Mughal court. Parrots, prized for their mimicry, sometimes found themselves at the heart of palace gossip, inadvertently, or perhaps intentionally, repeating private conversations, political grumbles, or, as in this case, inflammatory poetry deemed inappropriate by the court. The charges are read with the same gravity as any human trial. Recitation of subversive verses in the presence of the emperor's concubines. The judge peers at the parrot, who responds with an enthusiastic rendition of "All hail the Mango King!" The courtroom dissolves into muffled snickers. The case hinges, it seems, on whether the parrot's phrases were learned innocently or whether the bird had been coached by a rival court faction. Historians still debate whether these parrot trials were serious reflections of Mughal anxieties over courtly gossip or more of the empire's elaborate pageantry at work. Regardless, the judge announces that the parrot will be temporarily confined to the palace aviary, forbidden from attending any more poetry recitals. It's a punishment both laughable and, one suspects, entirely ineffective. As the court breaks for a mid-trial nap, a peculiar but very Mughal tradition involving cushions, sherbet, and the gentle strumming of lutes, you sit back against the cool stone wall, the warm hum of nonsense trials lulling you into a gentle daze. You've only scratched the surface of Mughal animal justice, but already the patterns are clear. Ceremony over logic, ritual over result, spectacle over substance. And somehow, it all fits neatly within the empire's obsession with order and hierarchy. Even if that order involved monkeys in the witness box and parrots in the defendant's cage, you close your eyes briefly, letting the soft, courtly music drift over you, mingling with the distant laughter of monkeys and the flutter of peacock wings. Outside, the moon rises higher, casting long, sleepy shadows across the palace rooftops. The break is over, and as you stretch your legs, carefully of course, lest you trip over a wandering peacock, you notice the mood in the courtroom shift slightly. The next case promises to be more delicate, more political. The defendants? None other than the sacred cows themselves. Now, in the Mughal Empire, cows occupied a complicated space, revered by many, yet sometimes caught in the crosshairs of palace life. These creatures rarely appeared in court. When they did, the atmosphere grew tense, even in a courtroom known for its peacocks and parrots. Tonight's accusation? Grazing in restricted palace gardens, specifically the emperor's private lotus pond. Witnesses allege the cows caused chaos by stepping on delicate water lilies and contaminating the sacred fish pools. It's the kind of scandal that can't be ignored, no matter how holy the hoofed offenders. You shuffle closer to the front as the judge calls the case. 2 hefty cows are brought in, well, more politely escorted, each draped in fine cloths, their handlers nervously offering garlands to the court officials in hopes of softening the mood. The accuser, a high-ranking palace horticulturist, presents his evidence with trembling hands, sketches of trampled lilies, a distressed koi fish in a water bowl, and a statement from the emperor himself expressing his deep displeasure at bovine indifference to imperial property. The courtroom holds its collective breath. Even the monkeys, lounging on the balcony now that their sentence has been, well, loosely enforced, seem unusually attentive. Historians still argue whether these cases reflected genuine legal practice or whether they were carefully staged to send subtle political messages. Involving sacred cows in court required tightrope walking diplomacy. Too harsh a sentence could offend certain factions. Too lenient could invite accusations of favoritism. The judge, clearly aware of these dynamics, adopts an exaggerated solemnity, consulting ancient scrolls on animal conduct. A scribe reads aloud an obscure passage from a Sanskrit treatise, possibly outdated, possibly misquoted, suggesting that cows should be gently reprimanded but never publicly humiliated. The prosecution requests a symbolic punishment, the cows' handlers to pay a fine, and the cows themselves to be ritually cleansed in the palace fountain, a gesture designed to restore harmony rather than inflict any genuine suffering. A fringe tidbit emerges during the proceedings. Certain court poets had been known to compose sarcastic couplets about cows in court, subtly poking fun at the emperor's delicate sensibilities. One of these verses, allegedly scrawled onto the back of an official tax scroll, caused a minor scandal the previous year. The trial meanders forward with the sleepy pace of a monsoon afternoon. The cows, oblivious to the legal storm swirling around them, chew cud with regal indifference. You can't help but envy their calm. As the judge prepares his verdict, an old courtier leans toward you, whispering an ancient Mughal proverb, "Better to argue with a cow than with a bureaucrat. At least the cow listens." You stifle a laugh, the absurdity of the moment thick as the palace incense. The judgment is delivered in elaborate, flowery language that takes 10 minutes to announce what everyone already expected. A small fine, a gentle cleansing, and a stern reminder to palace staff to secure the garden gates. The cows are escorted out, looking entirely unrepentant. You trail behind as the court shifts focus. The next case involves parrots, again, but this time they are not merely accused. They are witnesses. It seems that two palace scribes had an argument over ownership of a rare parrot known for reciting couplets from the works of Amir Khusro. The parrot, possessing an inconveniently sharp memory, had been seized as evidence and was now expected to clarify its allegiance. The courtroom chuckles as the bird is placed on the witness stand, a tiny gilded perch, complete with a silk cushion. The judge, massaging his temples, requests the parrot to repeat its latest recitations. The parrot obliges, spouting a mix of love poetry, trade route prices, and, for reasons known only to itself, the names of several obscure spices. Historians still debate the sincerity of these performances. Was the court genuinely seeking the truth? Or was this another carefully staged display of the empire's love for ceremony over substance? The scribes bicker like children, each insisting the parrot's preferred phrases reflect their care and teaching. One insists the bird favors legal terminology. The other claims it prefers romantic metaphors. The parrot, with impeccable comedic timing, squawks, "Order in the court," followed by a mischievous giggle. The judge, possibly suppressing his own laughter, renders a Solomon-like verdict. The parrot is to be housed in the public aviary, free to recite to whomever it pleases, its ownership deemed communal. Both scribes grumpy. You barely have time to blink before the next defendant is called, or rather, wheeled in. A large, elaborately decorated cart rolls into the center of the courtroom, bearing tonight's accused, a somber-looking camel draped in bells and embroidered cloth, its massive, knobby knees folding gracefully as it settles onto the defendant's mat. The charge? Theft of ceremonial garlands. Yes, even the camels weren't exempt from the peculiar reach of Mughal justice, particularly when the theft involved objects deemed symbols of imperial dignity. Apparently, during a recent festival, the camel in question had snatched garlands from the imperial flower-bearers, consuming them right in the middle of the procession, much to the horror and barely concealed amusement of the assembled nobility. The court artist had even produced a vivid illustration of the incident, which was now passed around the courtroom like a beloved bedtime picture book. You stifle a chuckle as you catch a glimpse. The camel mid-chew, flowers hanging from its grinning mouth. The emperor himself in the background looking, frankly, more amused than enraged. Historians still argue whether these public animal trials functioned primarily as cautionary tales for the human court, subtly reminding servants and bureaucrats of the emperor's capacity to discipline any disorder, be it from men or beasts. Others posit they were grand distractions, a form of controlled entertainment designed to break the monotony of court life. In any case, the trial proceeds, with the camel's handler, an elderly man with a beard as unruly as his charge, standing nervously before the judge. He pleads ignorance, claiming the camel acted on instinct, tempted by the heady scent of jasmine and marigold. The judge, unimpressed, turns to the scribes for precedence, One scribe mumbles something about a case in Lahore where a goat was sentenced to wear a placard reading "Thief of Brocade" for a month. Another recalls an elephant being ordered to perform public bows as penance for disrupting a royal wedding. Amid this sleepy bureaucratic scramble, the court herbalist is called to testify. She solemnly confirms that while marigolds are not harmful to camels, their consumption during rituals is considered a breach of sacred etiquette. The camel, meanwhile, emits a loud, resonant burp, possibly in protest, possibly in satisfaction. Fringe tidbit: Mughal palaces employed a special caste of flower keepers, whose sole duty was to guard ceremonial garlands from such incidents. They took their jobs so seriously that one keeper allegedly resigned in disgrace after a peacock was caught absconding with a garland during the emperor's birthday feast. The judge finally renders his verdict, again favoring pageantry over practicality. The camel is to parade through the palace courtyard adorned in mock garlands made of faded paper flowers, a gentle humiliation that is more theatrical than punitive. The sentence is met with subdued giggles from the younger courtiers, who sketch caricatures of the camel in the margins of their scrolls. You find yourself sympathizing with the camel, who seems utterly unbothered by the entire ordeal, chewing lazily on its cud as if it were above the petty politics of the court. Perhaps it is. As the camel exits with the stately swagger only camels can pull off, the next case is announced. This one, however, brings a murmur of surprise even from the sleepiest of the court officials. Tonight's defendant is no ordinary animal. It's an entire troop of palace cats. Accused of what, you ask? Forming an illegal feline guild. You shake your head, blinking slowly. Yes, you heard right. According to the allegations, the cats of the Mughal palace had grown unusually organized, forming what palace servants whispered was an underground network, sharing fish, controlling access to certain storerooms, and, worst of all, allegedly accepting bribes of milk in exchange for favors. The court astrologer, called as an expert witness, why him, you wonder drowsily, testifies that the cat's unusual behavior coincides with an alignment of Venus and Saturn, a combination known, apparently, for sparking feline ambition. Historians still argue whether this was genuine astrology or a clever ploy to make the entire situation feel more cosmic and less ridiculous. The cats themselves are, of course, nowhere to be found, having presumably received advance notice of their summons. Instead, the court appoints a surrogate, a frazzled palace cook tasked with representing the accused, much to his visible horror. The trial becomes less a court proceeding and more an impromptu debate over the place of cats in Mughal society. Some courtiers argue the cats have served faithfully for generations, protecting the grain stores and palace kitchens from rodents. Others grumble that the cats have grown too bold, strutting through the banquet halls as if they owned the place. You can't help but smile at the sheer absurdity of it all, imagining a clandestine feline council meeting by moonlight, passing tiny scrolls back and forth with their paws. As the debate drones on, a fringe tidbit surfaces. During Emperor Akbar's reign, a royal decree was issued granting the palace cats a daily ration of milk, an early example of what might be considered animal welfare. Perhaps, you muse, the cats simply saw this as their historical right to unionize. Finally, the judge, his patience clearly fraying, declares a compromise sentence. The cats are to be granted continued access to the kitchens, but any cat caught demanding extra fish will be subject to ritual scolding by the head cook, a punishment that, as everyone knows, is entirely symbolic and thoroughly ineffective. The courtroom sighs in collective relief, the trial's end greeted with the soft padding of feline paws slipping back into the shadows. You stretch, the heady warmth of the courtroom mingling with the lingering scent of sandalwood and fish stew. Despite the theatrics, there's something comforting about the predictability of it all. In the Mughal animal courts, justice always finds a way to meander toward the least disruptive conclusion. As the court prepares for its next absurd chapter, you settle back against your cushion, eyelids heavy, mind wandering lazily over scenes of camels in garlands and cats in imaginary councils. The night is still young in the Mughal palace, and the parade of peculiar punishments is far from over. You blink slowly, the flicker of oil lamps casting long shadows across the richly tiled courtroom floor. The next defendant is being announced, and this time the accused brings a scent with it, a pungent, musky odor that has even the most seasoned courtiers discreetly covering their noses with silk handkerchiefs. It's a skunk. Yes, skunks were not native to Mughal India, but thanks to the ever-curious habits of the empire's traders and collectors, the emperor's menagerie now included at least 2 of these stripe-backed creatures. And tonight, one of them is accused of offensive excretions in proximity to noble guests. You can't help but smile at the charge. Even in your half-drowsy state, the phrase seems delightfully bureaucratic for what is, at its core, a skunk doing what skunks do. The prosecution, a delicate court perfumer whose livelihood depends on the court smelling as regal as it looks, presents his case with much flapping of scented scrolls. He details how the accused skunk had, during a private feast in the moonlit gardens, sprayed an entire delegation of Persian dignitaries, forcing them to retreat into the lotus ponds and causing what he dramatically calls an olfactory diplomatic incident. Historians still argue whether this episode truly sparked tensions with Persia, or if, as some fringe accounts suggest, the entire affair was a source of enduring court gossip and poorly drawn caricatures featuring the emperor himself fanning his nose. The skunk, of course, appears unfazed, shuffling nervously inside an ornate bamboo cage brought into the courtroom. The judge, pinching the bridge of his nose, asks the zoologist on duty for advice. The zoologist, who looks as though he's regretting every career choice that led him to this moment, admits that skunks cannot easily be trained out of their, well, signature behavior. He adds, almost as an afterthought, that some Native American tribes used skunks as a form of pest control, a tidbit which seems to confuse more than impress the court. The prosecution, however, demands symbolic justice. The skunk should be made to wear a bell, warning others of its approach. It's a laughable demand, but also strangely poetic, and you suspect more than one poet in the back row is already composing verses about it. Fringe tidbit. In Mughal perfumery circles, it was whispered that certain elite fragrances used skunk musk as a stabilizer, though naturally, no perfumer ever admitted this in polite company. The courtroom debates the proposed punishment at a pace that could put a snail to shame. The scribe reads out a section from the animal code, likely fabricated, that describes appropriate court conduct for foreign beasts. Finally, the judge rules, the skunk is to be escorted to a specially designed garden outside the city walls, where it will serve as guardian of the rose beds, its fearsome odor a deterrent against any would-be trespassers. As for the bell, the judge allows it, but only during official court events. For the amusement of the emperor's guests, you can barely keep your laughter contained. The vision of a skunk in a tiny silk bell collar patrolling rose gardens under the moonlight is almost too much. You lean back, letting the soothing nonsense of it all lull you into a soft, warm haze. But the court shows no signs of slowing. The next case involves, of all things, a group of palace pigeons accused of espionage. The charge is delivered with the gravity usually reserved for human treason trials. According to the palace guards, several of the pigeons had been spotted carrying messages tied to their legs, messages that, upon inspection, contained suspicious codes. One message, you learn, read only, green mango at noon, which, admittedly, sounds more like a snack request than a covert message. Historians still argue whether this reflects real Mughal concerns about espionage via animals, or whether, as some fringe court humorists claimed, it was a case of paranoid officials seeing plots in pigeon droppings. The pigeons themselves are, of course, silent. Well, mostly. One lets out a defiant coo that echoes around the hall as if mocking the court's pomposity. The head falconer is called in to testify. He argues that palace pigeons had long been used as message carriers, and it was not unusual for them to be co-opted by ambitious scribes or gossip-loving courtiers. He even suggests, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper, that some messages may have been written by palace poets seeking to amuse themselves during long, dull ceremonies. A fringe tidbit is shared by an old courtier who claims Emperor Babur himself once used pigeons to send flirtatious poems to a rival's court. The scribe dutifully notes this for posterity, though the judge rolls his eyes. After much deliberation, the pigeons are sentenced. Well, sort of. The judge orders them to be temporarily relocated to the outer aviary, with their legs dyed with harmless turmeric ink. This way, any new pigeon found without the telltale yellow legs would immediately be suspect. The solution is bureaucratic brilliance at its sleepiest. You imagine the pigeons themselves are utterly indifferent, their world revolving more around seed piles than spy networks. You rest your chin on your hand, the courtroom's soothing cadence washing over you like a soft tide. The parade of absurd animal justice has a hypnotic rhythm now, a gentle, rolling absurdity that's both deeply silly and oddly comforting. The next case file is brought forward with much pomp, and as you blink slowly in the dim light, you hear the faint rustle of court officials readying the next parade of improbable defendants. But your thoughts drift elsewhere, to the skunk now proudly patrolling rose gardens, the pigeons cooing indignantly in their turmeric anklets, and the quiet, enduring belief of the Mughal court that even the world's most ridiculous problems could be solved with enough scrolls, poetry, and performative justice. You stretch your legs, careful not to disturb the sleeping cat by your foot, a likely member of the notorious kitchen guild, and settle back in for the next act of the sleepy, nonsensical opera that is Mughal animal law. As your eyelids grow heavier, the next case is announced with a flourish that seems wildly disproportionate to its subject: a parrot. But not just any parrot. This one is a prized resident of the emperor's private aviary, known throughout the palace for its unnervingly accurate impersonation of high-ranking officials. The charge? Spreading seditious gossip by mimicking the chief vizier's voice in, shall we say, less than flattering tones. The court clerk, barely concealing a smirk, reads the formal accusation aloud. Knowingly sowing disharmony among the emperor's council through unauthorized vocal impersonation. You rub your temples. Only in the Mughal courts could a parrot stand accused of political subversion. The accused parrot, perched grandly upon a jewel-encrusted stand, eyes the proceedings with what you might call a hint of smugness. The creature lets out a loud, perfectly pitched, "His Excellency has a head shaped like a turnip," sending the courtroom into muffled giggles and gasps. Historians still argue whether the Mughal court truly believed the parrot understood its words, or whether, as some suggest, this was another example of performance justice, a way to remind ambitious officials of their vulnerability to both human and feathered satire. The chief vizier himself, red-faced and fuming, demands severe punishment, calling the parrot a threat to imperial decorum and the dignity of the council. You suspect the real threat is to his personal ego, more than state stability. The court calls upon the palace linguist, a man with an impressive mustache and an even more impressive collection of bird whistles, who testifies that parrots can, indeed, mimic speech with uncanny precision but lack comprehension of meaning. The linguist adds, as an almost sleepy aside, that in certain Sufi circles, parrots were seen as spiritual metaphors for humans repeating teachings they barely understood. This fringe tidbit seems to confuse more than enlighten the court. The prosecution pushes for the parrot's beak to be gilded shut, a horrifying suggestion that draws a collective gasp from the animal lovers present. The emperor's youngest daughter, known for her fondness for the parrot's salty impressions, intervenes with a counter-proposal. The parrot should be made to recite only verses of poetry from now on, its cage adorned with a plaque reading, "Official Poet of the Avian Court." The judge, perhaps sensing the audience's favor shifting toward mercy, or perhaps just desperate to finish the day's docket, rules in favor of the princess's suggestion. The parrot is to be trained by the court poet, ensuring its next impersonations involve flowery metaphors rather than vegetable-headed viziers. You chuckle softly as the parrot, unfazed, squawks, "Turnip! Turnip!" one last time before being gently escorted from the courtroom. Next up, the court herald announces a case that makes even the sleepiest scribe sit up a little straighter. The defendant: a squad of royal monkeys. Their crime? Raiding the imperial kitchens and absconding with a ceremonial pudding. You blink. Yes, ceremonial pudding theft. Apparently, this pudding was no ordinary dessert, but a saffron and almond delicacy prepared exclusively for the emperor's birthday. The monkeys, clever opportunists that they were, had launched a coordinated nighttime raid, not only stealing the pudding, but also smearing sticky handprints all over the royal portraits along the banquet hall. Fringe tidbit: Mughal kitchens operated under a labyrinthine hierarchy, with dozens of specialized cooks, some for rice, some for chutneys, others solely for puddings and sweets. Losing a dish of this significance was seen as not just a culinary failure, but a cosmic imbalance. Historians still argue whether these monkey raids were spontaneous or whether certain disgruntled kitchen staff may have, shall we say, looked the other way. The monkeys, of course, are nowhere to be found, but the court insists on proceeding with the trial in absentia, a not uncommon practice in Mughal animal courts when the accused proved elusive. The cook responsible for the pudding, a trembling man named Abdul, stands in as the witness for the crime. He tearfully describes how he found the empty pudding vessel discarded on the palace roof, the monkeys dancing triumphantly in the moonlight, their faces smeared with saffron. The courtroom listens with the solemnity of a council debating matters of state. The astrologer is once again summoned, this time to explain whether the pudding's theft might portend misfortune for the empire. He consults his star charts and, after much humming and eyebrow twitching, declares that pudding theft is an omen of unexpected laughter, though he cautions that it might also encourage rebellion if left unpunished. The judge, stroking his beard, announces a compromise. Since the monkeys cannot be directly punished, the court will stage a symbolic trial. An effigy of a monkey will be constructed from dates and almonds, and publicly scolded during the next court gathering. Furthermore, extra guards will be posted at the kitchen entrances, and all puddings will henceforth be kept under lock and key. A fringe tidbit emerges from the shadows of the courtroom. It's whispered that the emperor himself found the whole incident hilarious and requested the court painter create an illustration of the monkey's pudding heist, which still hangs in the lesser-known corridor of the palace archives. You can almost picture it now, a gang of irreverent monkeys hoisting the pudding aloft, like victorious bandits. The courtroom settles into a satisfied hush, the absurdity of the trial somehow soothing in its predictability. You yawn, the warmth of the candlelight mingling with the subtle scent of cardamom drifting from the kitchens, where, no doubt, the cooks are now guarding their puddings as if they were imperial relics. Before you can drift entirely into sleep, the next case is called. And this one, you're told, involves an aquatic defendant, a palace fish accused of gluttony. You can only shake your head and smile as the imperial scribes shuffle their scrolls and prepare for yet another chapter in this endless parade of peculiar punishments. The flicker of torchlight plays off the polished marble as the latest case is ushered in with the usual, if somewhat exaggerated, ceremonial flair. This time, the accused is a fish, specifically one of the enormous ornamental carp from the palace's lotus pond, an opulent pool reserved for the emperor's personal contemplation, and, more importantly tonight, a source of bureaucratic headaches. The charge? Excessive gluttony. You blink slowly, your mind thick with the surreal fog of courtroom fatigue. Still, the scroll is read aloud with the same gravitas as if it were detailing treason among human nobles. The fish, named Gulab for its rose-colored scales, is accused of over-consuming the carefully rationed lotus petals and intimidating smaller fish, thereby disrupting the peaceful aquatic balance decreed by imperial law. Fringe tidbit. The Mughal elite were known for their obsession with ornamental fish, particularly carp and goldfish, and their pond ecosystems were often regulated with almost comical precision, down to daily feeding logs and spiritual blessings by court mystics. Historians still argue whether these highly choreographed ecosystems reflected genuine ecological understanding or simply the Mughal court's endless desire to impose human-like hierarchies onto every realm, even the watery ones. The plaintiff is the palace gardener, a gaunt man named Feroz, whose responsibility for the lotus blossoms extends, unfortunately, to ensuring they aren't devoured prematurely by Gulab's over-enthusiastic palate. Feroz, brandishing a wilting lotus stem as evidence, describes how Gulab's voracious appetite has led to the disappearance of nearly half the pond's prized blooms, throwing off the delicate color harmony admired by the emperor during his twilight meditations. The judge listens with his usual stoicism, though you sense a touch of fatigue settling over the entire courtroom. The notion of holding a fish trial seems to even stretch the patience of Mughal's ceremonial endurance. Yet, the proceedings must continue. The court astrologer once again takes the stage, truly earning his stipend tonight, and offers a mystical perspective. He declares that Gulab's greediness might reflect a cosmic imbalance in the pond's chi, though he cautiously adds that the fish may also be expressing spiritual hunger rather than mere bodily gluttony. This earns a polite smattering of nods from the more philosophically inclined courtiers. You, meanwhile, suspect the fish is just hungry. In a rare intervention, the court's master of fish-keeping, a rather somber man in seaweed-colored robes, suggests an innovative punishment. Gulab, he says, shall be relocated to a separate marble basin, where it will be fed plain rice water for 7 days, a purification period meant to realign its aquatic temperament. This strikes the court as both poetic and appropriately tedious. The judge agrees, and the ruling is formalized with an elaborately worded decree that includes no fewer than 4 flowery synonyms for greedy. Fringe tidbit. It's said that in certain Persian poetic traditions, greedy fish symbolized wayward souls, forever hungry and never satisfied. A metaphor the court poet is no doubt scribbling furiously into the margins of tonight's minutes. As Gulab is gingerly netted and placed into a golden transport bowl, its gills flaring in what you can only imagine is silent fish indignation. You feel the soft, comforting rhythm of the courtroom returning. No matter how bizarre the cases became, the court moved at its own sleep-inducing pace, like a lullaby wrapped in silk scrolls and ceremonial perfumes. But your brief moment of repose is interrupted as the next case file is announced. This time, the defendant is an animal of far greater stature, both physically and politically. A war elephant. You sit up slightly straighter, intrigued despite yourself. The elephant, known as Malak the Stubborn, is not just any member of the emperor's stable, but a celebrated beast of battle and parade, draped in fine silks and rumored to have his own miniature army of attendants. Tonight, however, Malik stands accused of unsanctioned destruction of property and repeated insubordination. According to the filed complaint, during a recent military exercise, Malik had decided, quite deliberately, witnesses claimed, to veer off course and trample a decorative melon patch belonging to the Empress. Historians still argue whether the incident was a simple accident or a subtle message from the beast, whose mood swings were legendary among stable hands and generals alike. The stablemaster, a grizzled veteran with a permanent squint, defends Malik fiercely, insisting the elephant was merely startled by a swarm of bees and that any rumors of deliberate melon stomping were wild exaggerations, likely started by the melon vendors hoping to raise prices through imperial pity. The court jester, ever the opportunist, adds a fringe tidbit that Malik had once been taught to teach. As Malik is led from the hall, his golden anklets jingling softly, the judge clears his throat to announce that the next case will involve an animal far less grand, but no less notorious. A palace goose accused of disrupting prayer sessions with irreverent honking. You let out a soft chuckle. Of course, there would be a goose trial, and as the court scribe unrolls yet another scroll of accusations, you settle deeper into the plush cushions, ready to drift along with the absurd current of animal mischief and human ritual. The next case is one that feels almost too absurd to be true. Yet here you are, eyes heavy with the promise of sleep, watching as the imperial herald steps forward with an entirely new scroll. This time the charge is simple and somehow ridiculous in its specificity. Irreverent honking during sacred prayer sessions. The accused? A goose named Ganga, owned by the imperial cook, who is, for reasons unknown, terribly fond of this bird. As the herald reads the accusation aloud, you can't help but wonder how, in this most sacred of courts, a goose can possibly be brought to trial. The audience shifts restlessly, unsure whether to be appalled, amused, or intrigued. The charge itself sounds straightforward enough. During the emperor's weekly prayer sessions in the private chamber, Ganga would consistently interrupt the solemn recitations with loud, unseemly honks, throwing the ritual into chaos. A truly dissonant sound amid the otherwise harmonious chanting of the palace priests. Apparently, Ganga had a penchant for honking the moment the priest invoked the name of the great Mughal ancestors, as if she had taken issue with their legacy, or perhaps simply the cadence of their prayers. Fringe tidbit. The Mughals were deeply religious, with various sects of Islam, Hinduism, and even occasional Buddhist practices interwoven into the palace's daily rituals. The emperor, an increasingly private man in his later years, would often withdraw into these prayer chambers to seek solace and spiritual guidance from his advisors. Historians still argue over the role of animals in the court's spiritual life, with some suggesting that animals, like Ganga, were thought to have a direct connection to the divine and could interrupt rituals when they felt something was amiss. You can't help but wonder if the goose was simply trying to correct what it found lacking in the emperor's quiet worship. The accused goose stands in the dock, its feathers impeccably groomed, and eyes darting between the human faces around it. You suspect the bird has no idea why it is here, but Ganga seems as self-assured as ever, waddling back and forth as though leading a parade, her beak pointed triumphantly toward the back of the room. The cook, a plump man named Raj, stands next to the goose in his defense. His argument is heartfelt. He insists that Ganga's honking is not intentional, but merely a manifestation of her exuberance at the emperor's presence. "It's the divine call of nature," Raj exclaims, raising his hands in supplication. The courtroom remains still as a stone. The court's chief priest, who looks about as pleased as a man about to be interrupted mid-sermon, leans forward and mutters something about distracted worship and the need for sanctity in the holy space. He adds with a long sigh that this was not the first time a palace animal had disturbed a religious event. The judge, who you are starting to realize might actually enjoy these cases more than he lets on, gives a slow nod. Perhaps he too finds some strange comfort in these odd, low-stakes moments of court life. The judge asks the palace linguist, who has somehow managed to hold on to his reputation as the go-to animal whisperer, to analyze whether Ganga's honking could be interpreted as a form of divine protest. The linguist, always a character who speaks with the utmost seriousness about the most absurd things, stands, adjusting his oversized spectacles, and declares, "The honks, though loud, lack any discernible meaning. However, I would argue that Ganga, being an animal of superior intellect, is merely expressing disapproval of the human tendency to overcomplicate spirituality." A low murmur ripples through the courtroom. The emperor's chief advisor, ever the pragmatist, suggests that perhaps a more practical solution might be found. Could the goose be moved to another part of the palace during prayer? The court agrees that such a measure would be the most sensible, though the humor of the situation is not lost on anyone present. The judge, after a few moments of contemplation, pronounces the verdict. Ganga shall be relocated to a quiet garden area, far from the emperor's prayer chamber, where she can honk to her heart's content. The idea of a goose in the palace gardens honking freely while the emperor prays in peace seems almost poetic, a quiet resolution to an almost ridiculous problem. The next case is one that feels almost too absurd to be true. Yet here you are, eyes heavy with the promise of sleep, watching as the imperial herald steps forward with an entirely new scroll. This time the charge is simple and somehow ridiculous in its specificity: irreverent honking during sacred prayer sessions. The accused? A goose named Ganga, owned by the imperial cook, who is, for reasons unknown, terribly fond of this bird. As the herald reads the accusation aloud, you can't help but wonder how, in this most sacred of courts, a goose can possibly be brought to trial. The audience shifts restlessly, unsure whether to be appalled, amused, or intrigued. The charge itself sounds straightforward enough. During the emperor's weekly prayer sessions in the private chamber, Ganga would consistently interrupt the solemn recitations with loud, unseemly honks, throwing the ritual into chaos. A truly dissonant sound amid the otherwise harmonious chanting of the palace priests. Apparently, Ganga had a penchant for honking the moment the priest invoked the name of the great Mughal ancestors, as if she had taken issue with their legacy, or perhaps simply the cadence of their prayers. Fringe tidbit. The Mughals were deeply religious, with various sects of Islam, Hinduism, and even occasional Buddhist practices interwoven into the palace's daily rituals. The emperor, an increasingly private man in his later years, would often withdraw into these prayer chambers to seek solace and spiritual guidance from his advisors. Historians still argue over the role of animals in the court's spiritual life. with some suggesting that animals, like Ganga, were thought to have a direct connection to the divine and could interrupt rituals when they felt something was amiss. You can't help but wonder if the goose was simply trying to correct what it found lacking in the emperor's quiet worship. The accused goose stands in the dock, its feathers impeccably groomed and eyes darting between the human faces around it. You suspect the bird has no idea why it is here, but Ganga seems as self-assured as ever, waddling back and forth as though leading a parade, her beak pointed triumphantly toward the back of the room. The cook, a plump man named Raj, stands next to the goose in his defense. His argument is heartfelt. He insists that Ganga's honking is not intentional, but merely a manifestation of her exuberance at the emperor's presence. "It's the divine call of nature," Raj exclaims, raising his hands in supplication. The courtroom remains still as a stone. The court's chief priest, who looks about as pleased as a man about to be interrupted mid-sermon, leans forward and mutters something about distracted worship and the need for sanctity in the holy space. He adds with a long sigh that this was not the first time a palace animal had disturbed a religious event. The judge, who you are starting to realize might actually enjoy these cases more than he lets on, gives a slow nod. Perhaps he too finds some strange comfort in these odd, low-stakes moments of court life. The judge asks the palace linguist, who has somehow managed to hold on to his reputation as the go-to animal whisperer, to analyze whether Ganga's honking could be interpreted as a form of divine protest. The linguist, always a character who speaks with the utmost seriousness about the most absurd things, stands, adjusting his oversized spectacles, and declares, "The honks, though loud, lack any discernible meaning. However, I would argue that Ganga, being an animal of superior intellect, is merely expressing disapproval of the human tendency to overcomplicate spirituality." A low murmur ripples through the courtroom. The emperor's chief advisor, ever the pragmatist, suggests that perhaps a more practical solution might be found. Could the goose be moved to another part of the palace during prayer? The court agrees that such a measure would be the most sensible, though the humor of the situation is not lost on anyone present. The judge, after a few moments of contemplation, pronounces the verdict. Ganga shall be relocated to a quiet garden area, far from the emperor's prayer chamber, where she can honk to her heart's content. The idea of a goose in the palace gardens honking freely while the emperor prays in peace seems almost poetic, a quiet resolution to an almost ridiculous problem. Fringe tidbit. There's a whisper among the servants that Ganga's ultimate fate was not as peaceful as the court imagined. Some say that the goose became somewhat of a local celebrity, even drawing in a few curious diplomats from neighboring kingdoms who wanted to witness the holy honker for themselves. Ganga, it is said, grew rather fond of the attention and even took to following the emperor around the gardens, although never again during his prayers. The court dismisses the case, and Ganga is ushered out of the room, feathers ruffled but clearly unfazed. The emperor, you sense, will be spared the distraction of goose honking during his most sacred moments, and yet there's a quiet sense of absurdity that lingers in the air, a strange but soothing reminder of the peculiarities that made the Mughal Empire's courts so endlessly fascinating. As the next case is called, you can feel your eyes starting to close, the absurdity of the trials still lingering like a soft hum in the background. The next defendant? A royal mongoose accused of misplacing a set of ceremonial daggers. You can hardly believe it. But then again, in this court, what wouldn't make sense? You can hardly believe your ears when the next case is called The Imperial Monkey versus the Emperor's Favorite Vase. You sit back, feeling your eyelids grow heavy as you wonder just how far this animal court can go. As the herald reads the charge, you get the sense that this trial is set to be another curious spectacle. The story, it seems, revolves around a prized vase, a delicate artifact said to have been crafted in the distant lands of China and presented to the emperor as a symbol of goodwill. Its porcelain surface is intricately painted with scenes of serene landscapes, dragons, and mythical beasts, and it has become, over the years, the emperor's favorite decorative piece in his private study. But one day, the vase was found shattered, its pieces scattered across the marble floor. The accused? An imperial monkey named Babu, known for his cheeky antics and quick hands. It appears that Babu had been caught red-handed in the royal study, his tiny paws covered in the shattered remnants of the vase. The scene must have been quite the sight. Babu, with a look of utter innocence, sitting amid the wreckage, as if admiring his own handiwork. Fringe tidbit. While the Mughal Empire was known for its grandeur, many of the emperor's private possessions were kept in personal chambers, guarded by only a few trusted servants. The emperor's penchant for Chinese artifacts was part of a broader trend during his reign. There was a growing interest in collecting exotic goods from all over the world, particularly from regions with whom the Mughals maintained diplomatic ties. Historians still argue about the true significance of the emperor's love for these artifacts. Some suggest it was a symbol of his cosmopolitan outlook, while others believe that these gifts were used as a way to cement relationships with foreign powers. Either way, Babu's alleged destruction of the vase certainly adds a touch of farce to this otherwise refined pursuit of diplomacy. The courtroom is filled with whispers as the trial takes its first breath. The accused, Babu, stands before the court, seemingly unaware of the seriousness of the matter. He tilts his head from side to side, scratching behind his ears, as if he is simply enjoying the attention. There's a certain charm to his demeanor, one that makes it difficult to truly believe he could have intentionally destroyed such a precious object. The defense, as you might expect, is swift and unrelenting. A royal servant named Karim steps forward, his face flushed with the effort of maintaining a serious expression. He argues that Babu had been playing near the vase when he was startled by a loud noise from outside the window. The vase, Karim claims, was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, toppling over when Babu, frightened by the noise, leapt into the air to escape. Historians still debate whether such animal behavior could be understood in such terms. After all, monkeys are often thought of as mischievous but highly intelligent creatures. The question remains, did Babu truly knock over the vase out of fear? Or was there something more at play in his antics? The chief priest, who has now settled into a more relaxed role in these trials, raises an eyebrow. Did the vase appear to be in a precarious position, perhaps already unsteady? He asks, almost absent-mindedly, as if pondering this very scenario. His question seems to touch on an important point. Could it be that the vase was more prone to tipping over, perhaps due to a slight imbalance in its placement, rather than the monkey's interference? The defense, still passionate, nods in agreement. It is highly likely that the vase, though valuable, was not situated as securely as it should have been. I submit that this tragic incident was purely accidental. Karim gestures towards Babu, who seems to have lost interest in the proceedings altogether, now more focused on a bright red fruit resting on a nearby table. The prosecutor, a stern man with a face carved from granite, looks less convinced. But why was Babu in the study at all? He demands. Isn't it a bit too convenient to blame this on the noise from outside? Surely a monkey, trained in the ways of the court, would have known to stay away from such valuable objects. This question hangs in the air, heavy with the weight of the prosecutor's skepticism. It's true that Babu had been a part of the royal menagerie for many years, performing tricks, fetching items, and entertaining guests. He was well known for his antics and his ability to mimic human behavior, often delighting the court with his cleverness. And yet, in the face of this trial, it's hard to ignore the possibility that Babu may have been simply caught in a moment of mischief, curious, playful, and ultimately destructive in his pursuit of fun. There's a certain irony in the situation. The very thing that made Babu a beloved member of the court, the same cheeky personality that had charmed everyone for so long, was now the reason he stood before the court. The judge, who has been listening intently, finally leans forward. His voice is calm but firm as he addresses the court. This trial is not about whether Babu intended to destroy the vase. It is about whether the loss of this vase is so great that we must punish the creature who inadvertently caused it. I believe that the emperor would not wish for such a trivial matter to become a cause for conflict. The judge rules that Babu is not guilty of intentional damage, but suggests a different kind of punishment, a temporary banishment from the royal study. He is to be sent to the palace gardens, where he can continue his playful ways without the risk of destroying more valuable objects. The court agrees, and the trial ends with a collective sigh of relief. Babu, ever the opportunist, leaps from his perch and scampers out of the room with a final cheeky glance at the gathered crowd. Fringe tidbit. After the trial, it's said that Babu returned to the palace gardens and became an even greater source of amusement. He was often seen sneaking into the kitchens, stealing fruits, and performing for the court in exchange for treats. As for the vase, it was repaired by the finest artisans of the empire, though the story of its near destruction became one of the most talked-about legends in the royal court. With the trial concluded, you can feel the weight of the evening slowly settling in. Another case, another bizarre trial, and the Mughals continue to prove that their justice system, while strange, was never boring. You yawn quietly as the next case is called. This one, it seems, involves a very disgruntled peacock accused of making too much noise during a royal banquet. The next trial begins with an air of peculiar anticipation. The herald's voice rings out as he announces, "The imperial peacock versus the banquet of silence." You can't help but let out a quiet sigh. Another animal, another case that seems to grow more absurd with each passing moment. The peacock, it seems, has been causing a bit of a ruckus. It all began during a grand banquet hosted by the emperor, where nobles, dignitaries, and visitors from foreign lands gathered to feast on an extravagant spread. The courtyard was alive with chatter, the clinking of silverware, and the delicate hum of courtly music. Everything was proceeding as planned, until the peacock entered. It was a majestic creature, no doubt, with feathers that shimmered in iridescent shades of blue and green. But the problem lay in the peacock's booming call, a loud, shrill cry that could be heard across the entire banquet hall. Its timing couldn't have been worse. Just as the emperor was preparing to offer a toast to the assembled guests, the peacock's voice shattered the delicate atmosphere, ringing out across the courtyard. Fringe tidbit. The Mughal court, famous for its lavish banquets, was a place where sound played an important role in setting the mood. Musicians would carefully choose instruments, and the arrangement of seating was done to create an atmosphere of both grandeur and refinement. The peacock, on the other hand, was often considered a symbol of beauty, grace, and even royalty, thanks to its associations with the goddess Saraswati. However, it seems that on this particular night, the peacock's vocal talents were more a source of annoyance than admiration. Historians still debate whether the peacock's call was truly disruptive enough to warrant a trial, or if it was simply a matter of one unfortunate bird choosing the wrong time to be its loudest. Perhaps the emperor's taste for quiet, serene banquets had simply collided with the natural behavior of this magnificent animal. The emperor, who was known for his love of decorum, could not let this disruption slide without consequence. The peacock was promptly seized and brought before the court. As you look at the creature, its elegant feathers ruffled from the commotion, you wonder how an animal so regal could find itself caught in such a petty dispute. The defense, naturally, is swift. A court servant named Naresh steps forward, his face apologetic but determined. "Sire," he begins, "the peacock did not intend to disrupt the banquet. It is simply the nature of these magnificent creatures to make noise, particularly when they feel threatened or when they are displaying themselves in front of others." Historians still argue about the motivations of the peacock. Was it really trying to show off for the guests? Or was it perhaps frightened by the loud conversations and clattering silverware? Some suggest that the bird's loud cries were simply a result of the excitement of being surrounded by so many people, while others believe it was a display of territorial dominance. The prosecutor, a particularly sharp-tongued member of the court, retorts, "It is not the noise itself that is the issue, but the timing. The emperor's toast was about to begin, and this creature, this symbol of beauty, has managed to ruin the moment with a cacophony of sound." As the prosecutor speaks, you feel the tension in the room build. The emperor's face remains inscrutable, though you can tell by the furrowed brow that he's not entirely pleased by the interruption. You wonder, if only for a moment, whether the emperor's obsession with silence and order has led him to see this bird as a mere annoyance, an obstacle to the perfection of his banquet, rather than the graceful creature it truly is. The chief scribe, who has been recording the proceedings with his usual focus, now speaks up. "Perhaps," he muses aloud, "the peacock was simply doing what it knows best, performing. It is said that the peacock's call is considered a song in some parts of the world, an offering to the gods, even." At this, a murmur ripples through the court. The idea that the peacock's cry might have been some form of divine offering catches the interest of a few scholars seated in the back. Could it be, one of them asks, that the bird was simply fulfilling its role in the cosmic order, as it has for centuries in royal courts across Asia? The emperor, who has been listening intently, finally speaks. His voice is calm, but carries the weight of authority. "I believe it is not the bird's call itself that I find troubling," he says. "Rather, it is the timing. There is a time for everything: prayers, songs, and even the simplest of meals. The disruption was not intentional, but it still must be addressed." With that, the judge steps in, offering his ruling. "While the peacock cannot be blamed for its natural behavior," he says, "it is still the responsibility of the court to maintain harmony. I hereby rule that the peacock will be temporarily relocated to the palace gardens, where it can continue its calls at a more appropriate time." The crowd seems to nod in agreement. It's a fairly light punishment, all things considered, but one that maintains the delicate balance of order within the court. The peacock, seemingly unaware of the gravity of the situation, is escorted out of the courtroom by a pair of guards, its tail feathers trailing behind it like a shimmering curtain. Fringe tidbit. After the trial, it's said that the peacock's calls became even more frequent, especially in the quieter parts of the palace. Some courtiers began to view the bird's vocalizations as a form of good luck, believing that the peacock's song was a reminder to remain calm and centered amidst the chaos of daily life. Historians still debate the symbolism of the peacock in Mughal culture. Some claim it was seen as an auspicious symbol of royal power, while others view it as a reminder of the delicate balance between nature and civilization. You take a deep breath, your mind wandering as the next trial begins, one involving a tiger, a stolen drum, and a very disgruntled musician. It's hard to believe how one court could host so many bizarre cases. Historians still debate the reliability of this defense. After all, the tiger had wandered into the courtyard without anyone noticing its presence. Could the royal security system, so finely attuned to human needs, have failed to consider the possibility of an animal incursion? Or was it simply an unfortunate coincidence that the tiger, in its curiosity, had been allowed to roam free during such an important occasion? The prosecution, however, sees things differently. While it may be true that the tiger's behavior was not malicious, the consequences of its actions cannot be ignored. The drum was damaged, and it was the tiger's paws that caused the damage. Should an animal be allowed to disrupt the court's proceedings with impunity? As the court deliberates, the scene grows strangely serene. You feel almost as if the entire issue could have been resolved with a gentle nod from the emperor or a soft pat to the tiger's head. But instead, the judge, who has been silent until now, rises to make his ruling. While the tiger may not have had malicious intent, the judge says, its actions have disrupted the event. As a result, the court will issue a temporary suspension of the tiger's public appearances for a period of 1 month. During this time, the emperor will arrange for the drum to be repaired at his own expense as a sign of his generosity. The ruling is met with quiet approval, and the tiger, it seems, is pardoned for its unintended destruction. The crowd murmurs its agreement, and the emperor, satisfied with the decision, nods his approval. Shams, though still holding the damaged drum, bows low, grateful for the court's fairness. Fringe tidbit. After the trial, it's said that Shams returned to his performances, though he was more cautious about his instruments from then on. The tiger, for its part, was allowed to return to its cage, where it resumed its peaceful existence, occasionally wandering near the drums in the menagerie. Some speculate that the tiger's behavior was an early sign of the complex relationship between animals and humans in the Mughal court, where both were sometimes equally revered, if not for the same reasons. With the trial concluded, you let out a sleepy breath. Another case settled. Another moment in Mughal history marked by its peculiar blend of absurdity and reverence. The air in the courtroom feels a little heavier now as you brace for the next case. You can already hear the murmurs of the court as the herald steps forward with the next announcement. The imperial parrot versus the Sultan of Silence. You can't help but chuckle at the absurdity of it all. Another animal, another trial, and this time, the issue is nothing less than a parrot's incessant talking. The parrot in question, named Chandu, was a beloved member of the emperor's menagerie. Known for its vivid green feathers and the sharp, almost human-like quality of its voice, Chandu had become something of a royal companion. The emperor, who had a great fondness for all things exotic, took particular delight in Chandu's ability to mimic the words of the courtiers. But it wasn't just the emperor who adored the bird. Many in the court had grown accustomed to its antics, and Chandu's voice had become a fixture of daily life in the palace. Fringe tidbit. The Mughal emperors were known for their love of animals, especially birds. Many of the court's birds, including parrots, were trained to mimic human speech, and their ability to repeat phrases often earned them a special place in the emperor's inner circle. Chandu, however, was particularly skilled, and some say that he could imitate the emperor's voice so perfectly that even the most seasoned courtiers would mistake him for their ruler. But not everyone in the court was as fond of Chandu's chatter. A certain nobleman, a man by the name of Sultan Mirza, had become increasingly irritated by the parrot's constant talking. Mirza, a man known for his quiet demeanor and reserved nature, had grown tired of hearing the parrot mimic the voices of his fellow courtiers. At first, it was amusing, even charming, but soon the constant barrage of mimicked speech began to wear on his nerves. It wasn't just the sound, it was the fact that Chandu seemed to always know exactly when to repeat a conversation, even mimicking Sultan Mirza's own private words. Historians still debate the exact nature of Sultan Mirza's irritation. Was it the parrot's mimicry of his own voice that irked him? Or was it simply the fact that he could never have a private conversation without Chandu's voice echoing through the halls? Some suggest that Mirza was a man who cherished his silence, and that the parrot's incessant chatter was a direct affront to his peace of mind. One evening, during a particularly grand dinner in the emperor's palace, Sultan Mirza had finally had enough. As the court gathered around the lavishly set tables, Chandu began repeating phrases from the previous conversation. Specifically, some rather private remarks Mirza had made about another nobleman. The emperor, amused by the bird's mimicry, chuckled along with the courtiers. But Mirza's face grew darker with each repetition. In a fit of frustration, Sultan Mirza stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the marble floor. The entire room fell silent as he approached Chandu's perch.